Hey, welcome to the FitMind podcast. It's been a while, been away for over a year now, and it's really good to see you back here. I'm excited to welcome a guest who's been a longtime mentor. His name is Doug Kraft, and he has explored the mind extensively from many different angles. So he's been a psychotherapist, Unitarian Universalist minister. He's been a meditation teacher and trained with some of the greatest meditation teachers around the world, and we share Bhante Vimalaramsi as both of our kind of main teacher. And he's also studied bioenergetics and brings a lot of neuroscience into his writings. He's written several books. This is a recent one called Presence, Quiet Awareness and How It Emerges in Meditation and the Brain. And he has a more recent book called Deepening. So I hope you'll enjoy this far-reaching conversation, get into consciousness and many kind of deep topics, exploring the mind and how you can train it. So without saying anything further, here is my conversation with Doug Kraft. Doug, welcome to the FitMind podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Glad to be here.
And I hear you're fresh off of a meditation retreat. Is that right?
Nope.
You're headed...
No, what I had mentioned was that I just gave a talk to the largest Buddhist Sangha here yesterday morning. Oh, and yes, I've been on a sort of quasi retreat here for about a week.
Okay, lovely. For those who haven't attended a meditation retreat, what would that kind of look like in your day-to-day life?
Well, the usual image of a retreat is you go off on some private setting someplace, and so you get completely out of your, the accoutrements of your life, and you kind of submerge yourself in another environment. And then there's meditation schedules and interviews and stuff that's set up. When I'm doing a private retreat, though, I just go off by myself, and what I'm trying to do at this stage of my life, I'm 75, and I can feel my body, kind of slowing down a bit. And I'm trying to get my work down to the point where I can be sort of on a half retreat most of the time, which for me means meditating, 2.5 to maybe 4 hours a day, and then have family and other stuff and going on at the same time. My kids are all grown and out of the house, so there's my wife and me and Lila, our cat, interact loosely, and then I spend a lot of time meditating.
Well, it sounds like a good balance. I remember reading on your website once there were some instructions for kind of doing a home retreat, and one recommendation you gave based on, I think, something Ram Dass said, is that you could just go in your room for like 24 hours and essentially do nothing and learn a lot about your mind that way.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, and it was an interesting set of instructions too, because he was saying, well, so what you can do, well, you do some exercises and maybe, and so you go ahead and do all that, but you're not doing those for 24 hours. And then you twiddle your thumbs for a little bit, and then eventually you sort of run out of stuff to do, and you're just left alone with an unchaperoned mind. And that's basically what a retreat is, because for meditation, a lot of people aren't familiar with it. It has this kind of image of what you're trying to do is learn to control the mind and get it into a quote unquote meditative state. And the definition of meditation that I like much better, and it comes straight from the Buddha, is just to learn to observe what's going on in the mind. And it's an extremely optimistic view of humanity, in the sense that what the Buddha was saying, if we can just see clearly enough what's really going on, then we'll know what to do and what not to do. And so the trick is how to pull that off. And there from my perspective, there are two elements that are really important. So I call it kindness and wisdom. Um, and the two elements are one of finding some ways of naturally tapping into what you could call uplifted states. Um, things like, love, kindness, um, generosity, um, certainly equanimity, peacefulness, uh, uplifted qualities. And um, and of course, as anybody who's ever meditated for 10 minutes, realizes, is you can set that up for yourself and then the mind wanders off. Mind has a mind of its own. It'll just go. And so how you relate to the wandering mind and to relate to that skillfully is just incredibly important, because that's what you'll be doing a lot, is to how to figure out how to really bring the mind back to quiet. My wife is a birthright friend, and I was a Quaker. And so um, she started meditating when she was like 3 years old in this Quaker meeting. And there was an elder in that meeting who I met once, and wonderful, wonderful man. And he said, meditating is like trying to put a basket of puppies to sleep. And so you have this basket of puppies, and one sticks its head up, and so you scratch it behind the ears and stroke it a little bit, and it quiets down. And then another one sticks its head up, and you scratch it behind the ears, um, and eventually they'll all sort of quiet down. But I just really love that metaphor for it, because it has such a loving, respectful mind, loving, respectful attitude towards the mind and the heart, rather than trying to shape it up.
Right. Yeah, I think that's so true. Often the picture of meditation that's kind of portrayed in the mainstream would be focusing the mind on one thing. And here you're talking more about qualities of mind. Um, Now, you mentioned the Buddha, and I think some folks might not realize this was a historical figure. One thing I love about your work, Doug, is that you bring in these ancient wisdom texts and you've studied them very very much in depth, but you also bring in the modern science and you bring in your own direct experience. So you've talked about how there's kind of this trifecta where you can, when the three of these things agree, we can be pretty confident that we're getting at, an accurate map of how this works and how we can train the mind. The oral tradition, I just finished a book by Bhikkhu Analayo, who's done a lot of scholarly work on the oral transmission of these suttas, as we call them, these threads. And I think it's remarkable what has survived and how, even though the oral tradition does uh, allow for some drift, there's other pieces that were clearly very important and very rigorously preserved. So yeah, I think we can have a lot of confidence in certain aspects of this, and especially the teachings that seem to match our own experience. And um, one of those would be what's typically called dependent origination, this idea that the mind is causally linked, that there's pieces of our experience that lead to other parts of our experience. I wonder if you could explain it better than I can in a brief way that someone could notice in their own experience.
Well, um, I think the most fun way to do this is to take any aspect of yourself, maybe something you really appreciate, a habit, or the way you think, or the way you relate to people, and reflect upon it. And we're trying to trace back how you learned that. And so there's business about family history. Um, you could also look at it from a genetic standpoint. What things is just wired into your genes, and you trace those back. And there are cultural elements, and you can trace those back. Well, anything you trace back, I mean, you maybe get to an earlier generation of what life was like in your family as a kid or something. Well, and where did they get those values and habits? Well, that came, you know, from people before them and people before them. And if you keep tracing back, anything that you think of as who you are, eventually you will get back into, it's just like everything, how everything is directly or indirectly connected to everything else. And from that perspective, um, what we are, if you want to talk about me as a person, is a collection of qualities at a particular moment in time. But all those qualities that are there now came from earlier qualities. They arise dependent on earlier qualities, causes and conditions, is some of the language used in Buddhism. They all came out of other causes and conditions. So there's nothing here that is essentially me that is completely separate and isolated from everybody else, because everything that makes up me came from someplace else. So we just have this snapshot in the moment. Because the reality is that there is no essence within us which is fundamentally separate from everything else. And in the language, and in Buddhism and some other places too, they say it's we are empty of a self essence. If you have a glass and you say the glass is empty, it probably is not empty. There's probably air molecules, etc., but it's empty of water. And so that, yeah, there is this vessel and all this stuff that comes together, but it's empty of any self-sustaining, permanent essence all its own. That everything we are comes from something else. And it's a little mind-boggling. And sometimes when you really settle into it, it can be a little unnerving because we like to think of ourselves as there's something solid and real here. And there is something that's solid and real, but it's completely transient. You know, everything is changing from moment to moment, sometimes very subtly, sometimes in big ways.
Yeah, I guess one very practical example of that is just that after about 7 years, all the atoms in our body are different. So
Yes,
looking back, we could think that we were that person 7 years ago, but so much has changed that just in terms of the physical body, we can't even really call that the same person.
right, right. Uh, and so what you end up with in Buddhism, and some traditions in Buddhism talk about two realities, some talk about three. But the two realities are, I talk about, the absolute and the relative. And what we talk about, in cultural socially, is me. I'm going to the grocery store. Everybody knows what that means. Um, and so I'm relatively real, and it's very convenient, for organizing people and doing things. But on an absolute level, that just doesn't work because, yeah, all the atoms in my hands, are everything came from someplace else.
Mm.
And um, there's this lovely metaphor they use sometimes. It's like, even look at your hand. Well, the hand is made up of, well, a thumb and these four fingers, and there's a palm there. Uh, but where's the hand? Is it in the thumb? Well, not really. Is it in the fingers? Not really. So if you take all those elements apart, there's actually no hand there, but you put them together, and we would call that a hand, but there's no essence to it.
Mm.
Did that just go into outer space?
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. Basically, if I could phrase it in a slightly different way, that there's no the concept hand is built from a bunch of parts that individually there's no handness in it.
Right.
Um, I guess one place to go from here would be to discuss consciousness, because that's on the physical level, that the hand and the atoms and so forth. But on a kind of first person, direct, and subjective viewpoint, how could we think about consciousness as an emergent property that's conditioned from other things?
Um, yeah, so if we go into the science of it, it gets very interesting and hairy kind of quickly. So one of the ways that I look at consciousness from a scientific perspective is actually to start with homeostasis. So we have all these systems in the body, and they need to have a kind of homeostatic balance. For example, body temperature. Body temperature needs to be in a pretty tight range. You know, we get a temperature goes up 5 or 10 degrees or drops 5 or 10 degrees, and we're in trouble. Hydration, nutrition, on and on and on and on and on. So what happens when an organism's homeostatic balances go out, they either correct those or they die. It's pretty simple. And one of the quickest ways to get our attention is to make us hurt. And that's a great motivator to do something about it. And so you can have a very simple creature, you know, maybe a small worm or an ant or something like that, that would have a bunch of these little homeostatic systems. They go out of balance, and there's automatic push to go take care of that. You get into something like a human being, and we just have hundreds and thousands of homeostatic systems. And so when one of those goes out of balance, rather than being driven directly to satisfy that, if a hydration is low, it drives to get some water or something. With so many systems, they're going to conflict with each other. So what arises in us is a feeling of discomfort, which indicates that some of our systems are going out of balance. And as we balance in those, it feels good. And so we get these mass of feelings that give us some directions. But with a system as complicated as we are, there's no one solution that's going to be best every moment. And so we get a little bit of choice as to, okay, I'm hungry. There's an apple over there. There's a bear walking down the path towards the apple tree. I think I'll get away from the bear and come back and get the apple later. So we decide which one we're going to pay attention to. And out of that is how consciousness emerges. It's this system of weighing all these different feelings that arise. And the interesting thing about it is that it's really based on keeping us alive. So there's no way to avoid this stuff.
So this is kind of the workspace theory of consciousness, right? Or I think it also
Right.
relates to information integration theory, where there's this, you can think about consciousness as this kind of knowing element, this kind of space in which we're getting all these different signals, some of them conflicting. And then so it can know all of that and make choices or determine where to go from there. Almost this biological imperative to have another layer in the system that can make judgments and understand all these pieces of evidence that are coming.
Right. So the alternative to that is if you don't take care of it, then you die and those genes don't get passed on. But that takes a long time for things to evolve. So what happened at some time was there was this system, and what humans are particularly good at, or what the human brain is particularly good at, is creating models of what's going on out there in the world. And it's been a sort of survival mechanism. So I get this model. There's a hungry animal over there. I wonder what happened if I held my arm up to it. Well, rather than actually test it out, I can do that in my mind and realize, okay, that probably is not going to work so well. So we won't do that one. So it gives this, I should say, a kind of workspace where we can kind of make decisions. But I always like to go back to homeostasis because it ties it back to survival, which puts it right back into the core of what it means to be a living organism.
Right. I think in your book, Doug, you mentioned there's these kind of primal emotions, these very deep, uh, deeply embedded survival instincts that can kind of give rise to very, very primal feelings. For example, fear, and this would go back, many thousands and even millions of years as the nervous system evolved. Um, how does that play into consciousness?
Well, it's the most direct way to say it is the work of Jaak Panksepp, who was an Estonian American. I think it was at Washington University, um, and um, and he was sort of at his peak during the time when um, reward and punishment was the big deal, and in those kind of schemes, um, the behaviorists that look at reward and punishment think of emotions as being too abstract. They were just making all this stuff up. But he was interested in trying to trace down the biological origins of these emotions. And what he found was there are 6 or 7 of them, of which there are actually nodes in the brain that if you go in there, with a tiny scalpel or electric probe and burn that out, then that emotion is gone. Or you can go the other way, just go in there and stimulate it. So you can take a cat who is um, sleepy and lazing around, and if you get a little probe into the rage centers and just stimulate that, suddenly the cat goes, and it just flies into rage. There's nothing else happens, little electricity in there. So he found 7 of these that show up in all mammals. And the interesting about it, if you go in and you take out all 7 of those nodes, the creature goes unconscious. I mean, there just is no consciousness, without these 7 being active. And then those 7 can be modified and stuff by, the cerebral cortex and lots of other things. But it just makes a point at a very primal level. Without these things, we go into a coma. There is no consciousness.
Hmm. I guess that matches on, referencing back to the Buddha and his theory of codependent arising or dependent origination, that consciousness is conditioned by a feeling, by essentially, or proto thoughts and these kind of urges, almost you could say. I mean, this was him observing subjectively his mind. So he's looking at how his attention moves in a very deep meditative state, which is a bit different than our kind of objective probing. And I guess we can't know for certain that the correlation, like just because the experience of awareness shuts off when these brain circuits aren't active, doesn't mean those brain circuits cause the consciousness itself. But it is interesting that there are prior conditions that are necessary for the light of
Right,
awareness to be on there.
right, 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 right.
Yeah. Um, Fascinating. Now, I understand. Well, okay, so you have many different fields of interest, and you've kind of come at the mind from many different perspectives: psychotherapy, meditation, um, bioenergetics, and yeah, science. So, what are you most interested in now with regards to learning about the mind, with regards to consciousness?
Oh boy. Okay. Um, what interests me the most at this point is um, there's ways in which the mind constructs the reality around us. Um, one really kind of simple example of this is right now, as you're sitting here listening to us talk, if you just notice the your peripheral field of vision, you don't have to look at it, but just notice it. and notice if there are any colors in it. And I think most people will perceive lots of colors out there. Well, you're actually not seeing those colors because our perception of color is right in the fovea, right in the center of the eye. And then there are lots of rods around the rest of the eye that pick up black and white, but they don't pick up color. So when you see the color, it's not because the light is coming in and and triggering some neurons that are sending color information into the brain. It's because you have this construct out there, and you know from past experience, you know that this has this color and that's that, and there's a tree over here with some greens. There's a few oranges on it, and it seems like we're seeing that, but it's a mental construct. So maybe that gets a little too nerdy, but what I'm really interested in is what happens when our conceptual mind turns off. The deepest type of meditation, the conceptual mind can turn off. So that may seem weird to say, but so for example, when you look at an object out there, it takes a little bit of effort, a little bit of strain to sort of take those signals and put them together into a ball or a book or a lamp or a shelf. And it also takes a little bit of effort to take those perceptions and push them into memory. So as you relax more and more deeply without going to sleep, eventually it gets so quiet that the mind stops putting those things together into perception and stops putting those into memory. And so the experience at that moment is one of blankness, like there's nothing going on there, and it feels like you've dozed off to sleep, and then you come back out of it. But sometimes when people come out of those, if you'd actually fallen asleep, the mind would be kind of groggy when you come out. But actually, when somebody comes out of those, if it really is this process I'm talking about, they will be completely clear, very alert, deeply relaxed, obviously, but there's none of the grogginess. And so in deeper meditation, some of these mental processes can actually shut down. And so there's the question about how to cultivate that.
And why would somebody, Doug, for those who this might sound kind of
Weird.
yeah, it might sound weird for them. Like, why should they want to head in this direction of non-conceptuality and actually kind of shutting down their awareness?
Yeah, because of what happens right on the edge of that. So I can get, when I'm sitting for a long time, for a couple hours or something like that, my mind will get very, very still. But it's not completely still. And there'll be little tentative feelings and stuff. And I will notice, well, that feels like I'm about 6 months old. That feels like I'm about 3 years old. And they're just, kind of amorphous and stuff that's easy to overlook. But if I can see that and see that feeling of, say, being 3 years old, and I know what my father was like and my parents and stuff like that, and see those feelings, and just what I would say is relax into all of that. Um, there are just a lot of insights to just emerge right out of that whole process. So what I would say is deep therapy, which is insight based, and deep meditation, which is insight based, really actually blend together, because what you try to do in therapy is to open up to faint feelings that may be looming around in the background and maybe ones we push down or something like that, and just open up to all that and let it come up to the surface. It releases. And I don't know how to say this except to say that it feels like something that I thought of as essential to me, the Dougness, is gone. And it feels quite freeing. And I know that sounds really weird, um, but I'm just really interested in that. And part of what I do is just my own practice, and a part of it is reading, um, you know, various old meditation masters that are talking about processes and higher meditation, which really have to do with relaxing so much that the way that we construct the world and put colors out there and all that stuff starts to, it's not like it shuts off, but it just sort of drifts off into the background as being slightly less relevant. And there is a um, kind of joy and contentment that arises out of that, which is not contingent upon much of anything. And that's, I know that somehow this sounds very complicated, but it feels really simple and really basic and really very, very much alive.
Beautiful description, Doug. That's yeah, it's profound, and I know it's hard to put these things into words sometimes. Um, Part of what you were describing sounds like making subconscious processes more conscious, which I think people can
Exactly.
relate to
Yes. Yeah,
because
exactly.
that's something that would take place in therapy or we would want to do in all aspects of our lives, like at a more macro level, our habits, becoming conscious of the way we're thinking. But then what you're really describing goes much deeper than that because it sounds like your mind's so subtle that you can see just the tiniest movements and start to um, I guess let go of kind of buggy software on a deeper level, if that's a
Yeah.
way of putting it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's softening into those places where there's tension. So part of it as you're relaxing is looking at any place where something grabs. And then rather than trying to get rid of it, because that just puts more tension into tension, if you just let the awareness go into it and just open up to the tension, it's like scratching a puppy behind the ears. You just sort of stroke a little bit and it softens and it opens. And as it does that, then some of that tension begins to fade. And then you're left with a default state, which is quietly peaceful and sort of delightfully alive, and for which any particular identity as being this kind of person or that type of person just doesn't feel relevant anymore. We're just alive.
So is this kind of the classic no self or non-self experience that often the masters are talking about?
Yeah, yeah, and it's not like the self just disappears, but there are um, I can't think of a real good example of it, but just in general, it may be there's some situation that you're very upset about, and you're kind of stirring all around. And then you look at one point and say, what's the big deal there? Yeah, so somebody was upset. Well, see what we can do to take care of that. But I was meditating in Thailand, and and they put me in with a bunch of Westerners, and I didn't want to be with the Westerners. I want to be with the real people, but that's another story. Um, and there was somebody there who was um, trying to get us to do all kinds of things. So I went to the teacher and I was complaining about what this other person was doing. And the teacher said to me, "Ah, oh, yeah, misunderstandings happen." And I thought, yeah, misunderstandings do happen. Maybe that's why is this a big deal? Of course, misunderstanding happens. And the whole thing just seemed light. It wasn't like the situation disappeared, but it just wasn't that important anymore. And it's not like you end up with nothing in your life that's important anymore. It's like you go into a sort of a jelly brain state or something like that. It's that what is really most essential and most important just becomes very simple. Um, I have two grandchildren now, and I just um, when I spend the day with them, it's funny. It's like time moves differently. We get up in the morning, we start doing things, and we just sort of bumble along. And I get into their time space or something, and pretty soon, it's supper time, and I haven't. Wow, how did that day go by there? We're just, kind of being in the moment and enjoying it. So it's that kind of simplicity.
Mm.
And we have very complicated lives, and some things do need, some focused attention, etc. Um, but if we can see the tension that's generating and relax the tension in it, then our minds are less encumbered in terms of doing what needs to be done and just let the rest of it go.
Is there kind of a practical exercise that you could either lead us in or give for somebody who wants to try this out? Maybe they don't have time for like a longer meditation, but is there some way they could glimpse it?
Um, well, I'll tell you a little story. Um, this guy I know who has an incredible amount of equanimity and looked at he had a small business and looked at his bank account online one morning, and there was $100,000 that was missing. Um, and it's what actually happened is a long story, but there was some fraud and somebody had ripped him off, etc. But throughout this whole thing, he was like just completely unruffled. And so when we got through the other side, I want to go back and sort of pick his brains apart about what he actually did. And he said, well, when I looked at the bank account and saw that there was $100,000 missing, I knew that maybe I would never get it back. And if I could never get it back, there was nothing I could do about it. And there's really nothing to be upset about. It was just gone. But if I could do something about it, what would be the next thing for me to do? And what you thought, well, that would be to call the bank. And so he called the bank and he talked to them. And then what's the next thing to do? And he was never more than one step out. He never traced it all out. It's like, what would be the wisest thing to do in this moment as this? And just do that and then see what the situation, and just do that and then see what the situation is. And out of that, it was an incredibly efficient way of untangling a really gnarled situation. Um, And so that would be one thing. I know that doesn't sound at all like meditation, but it gets at the core of, what equanimity is. Um, and we get all excited and the mind spins out and we squeal our wheels or something, but it's just, no, just the next step. What's the next thing to do here? And you just go like that. In terms of a more meditative kind of exercise, um, what I would say is to um, sit quietly uh, send some wishes for your own well-being, to yourself or to somebody else. So you're just generating, we all know what kindness feels like. So you just invite some kindness to come up. And then if your mind will get caught and it'll be pulled off and you'll be sitting there, think about the grocery list or what so-and-so did the other day and think, oh, wait a minute, I was supposed to be meditating. And at that point, what you want to do is just see where the mind went. So recognize that, open up to it, recognize what was going on, relax into whatever the feeling is at that moment, and then smile. And try that for just a little bit, and then see how you feel when you get up. There's no guarantee this is going to work all the time, but it works much more than you might imagine.
So, what you're describing, Doug, sounds like a kind of reconditioning of the mind on different levels, too.
Yes.
You've first described almost this stoic exercise where it's like, if you can do something about it, then why worry? And if you can't, then why worry? And then you described on a more micro level how this can apply in any given moment, right? In any given moment that the mind gets tense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what the absolute core, I think, of the Buddhist meditation, and I almost hesitate to call it Buddhist meditation because I think it has links directly back to the Buddha, but I think he wasn't trying to create a system. He was trying to see how the system operated. That the thing that catches us all is this tension, is the way the mind grips. And if you can just watch that objectively, and part of the trick of that is I have this thing I call it the spectrum of awareness, and that awareness is made up of different qualities or different elements, let's say. The element of awareness that we notice most often is the content. That's what it's about. There's a bear walking down the path. There's my friend is over there. We see the content. There's this problem I try to solve. Um, and and if you're looking at the content, what you do is you release the content and look at the processes that are creating that content. I'm thinking, I'm worrying, I'm planning, etc. And once you can see those processes, so there's content, processes, those processes grow out of qualities in the mind. It's tight, it's loose, it's jumpy, it's smooth. And if you can see those qualities, then sometimes, and this is a bigger leap, but you can see the awareness itself. But just moving down that, uh, those sequence of elements.
Mm.
And the fifth one is the most mysterious. It's actually the emptiness out of which it arises. So you can be sitting there with the mind perfectly still and quiet. And in the next moment, it's off. Think about the grocery list of what happened, our presidential elections, or, who knows. And at that point, you could look at where the mind went, or you could look at where that thought came from. And the thought just came out of nowhere subjectively. And so you can go back and see the nowhere, the nothingness out of which this thought train started. And it's still right there. What happens, and this is just evolutionary breeding, is we are drawn to the content. But if we can come back from the content to the processes, to the qualities, to where all this stuff arises from, then you can find emptiness, stillness, peacefulness, equanimity, serenity, those peaceful qualities. And most people, it's what they want most. You ask somebody what they want most, and they say, well, I want a Tesla. And they say, I've got a magic wand. I can give you a Tesla, but there's one catch. If you own this Tesla, you're going to be unhappy. It's not because of Tesla, it's just because it's magic. And then so you still want the Tesla. Well, you might be tempted, but actually, if I could get an old 57 Ford, and be happy, I'd rather have that than a Tesla. So what it says is that we think these objects that we get are a thing that'll bring us happiness or contentment. But that can only be found within. And so if you find a direct way to this. So let me go back to your question back there a little earlier about how you can just tap into this quite directly. So here's the exercise. So you're sitting here, and there are thoughts and images, stories, memories, all kinds of stuff going through your mind. And that's pretty normal. Maybe they're hounding you, maybe they're just light, but they're there. And see if back behind all that, you can feel a place that is just still, that is just quiet. Just do it right now. See if you can feel that. And most people can. And then you can ask yourself, does this quiet feel new? Or does it feel ancient? It's a quiet that feels like it's been there forever. It's like something you keep learning about and forgetting. But, when you notice this quiet, it doesn't feel new. It feels like something that's always been there. It doesn't yell up and jump up and down and scream and wave its arms to get our attention. So it's very easy to ignore it. But every moment we're here, there is that quiet that is back there. It's got no agenda other than just being. And so one thing you can do is, 2 or 3 or 4 times a day, just stop for a moment and see if you notice the quiet. Don't make a big deal of it. Don't spend more than about, 5 to maybe 20 seconds. Just see if you notice it a little bit. If you do it, say, okay, and then just go on. And what'll happen if you do that is after a while, your mind gets it. Oh, you're interested in that quiet. So it starts showing it to you more often. The mind gets a lot of bad press. It really wants to do what we ask of it. But we just give it so many conflicting instructions. But if you just ask it every once in a while, it learns, oh, she wants to know that. Okay. So it starts showing it to you more.
Beautiful. I think one of the big practice insights I had came from you, Doug, which was that similar to what you were just describing, how normally the mind looks at objects, and in order to satisfy its desires, it thinks, if I could only have that object, whether it's a Tesla or even just a very simple, like a cup in front of it, and it wants to grab it. And it kind of has this instruction that once I reach my hand and grab the cup, then I will have satisfied that action, and then there'll be like a moment of relief, and then I can do the next thing. The next craving will come up a moment later. I have to do this, and then once you do that, then okay, what's next? So it's this constant kind of pull and then relief, pull and relief, and it's kind of tugging us around all day like that. But in the practice you described, there's kind of this redirecting of attention from the object itself to our relationship to that object.
Right.
Like awareness's relation to the content so it's kind of retraining it to look at the relief that's already there instead of being fooled into thinking that it's going to find relief outside of itself.
Right. And so what we come to believe, and this is part of the liability of living in a market-driven capitalist economy is that the economy is always saying you need to get stuff out there, you need to get stuff out there. So it gets pushed into us. And we think that the content of our awareness gets us thinking, pondering, worrying. And we think the thinking, pondering, and worrying makes us feel, good, bad, or indifferent, or other things. But it's really the other way around. What happens is there's a little bit of grief or sadness or happiness, and the mind looks around to find some reason for that. And so it clams onto some processes. So it's the feelings that create the processes, and then the processes grab hold of the content.
Mm.
And so if you can come back to the quiet and let it unwind it from the other end, then there'll still be trees and oranges and cars and stuff, all that stuff will be there, but you won't have your well-being hooked onto it quite so much, not quite so much. And all we need to do is just to get moving in that direction a little bit, just get started in the right direction. Don't worry about the end product, just get moving in the right direction, and then it'll gradually unfold.
So where would you recommend that somebody who wants to get started, beyond the practices you just gave, Doug? I guess, like, which of your books or which resources would you recommend for someone who wants to make this a part of their regular day?
Well, there's a couple of them. Buddha's Map was one that I wrote to because at that time there was nobody that had fully described the practice as taught by this teacher that I knew, Bhante Vimalaramsi. Yeah, that Buddha's Map. And that has all the foundational practices that are in that. There's also a little book that's called Beginning the Journey, which is just a pamphlet, which just has a stripped down beginning instructions. You can actually go to my website on dougcraft.com or easeandawake.com and then look at the books menu. And then you can go down to Beginning the Journey, and it opens up a page. And at the top of the page, there are links where you can buy the pamphlet or buy an ebook version. The whole book is also on a web page, so you can read it without buying anything. And what's more, I've got a PDF of the whole book that's there. You can open up and you can download a thing and get the whole thing for free. And all my books don't have all those elements in there, but Beginning the Journey, Buddha's Map, my next favorite one of the ones I've written was Befriending the Mind. Was when I took all the stuff I had learned from Bhante Vimalaramsi and put it in my own language. And then Presence weaves a lot of the neurology into it. And then there is the fundamental process by how I work with people, both in meditation and as a psychotherapist, which is called Deepening. And this is a thin little one, and I think you can download the whole thing as a PDF, or if you want a printed version, then you can get that through Amazon. But you can just poke around on the pages, there, and there's also there's too much information on it. There's a link that just has videos of talks I've done and some audios, and articles, and blogs, all kinds of stuff. But
Nice.
yeah,
so it's easingawake.com.
easingawake.com. And there's a subject index at the top of most of those menus where you can just actually look through topics and help you find stuff.
Wonderful. I guess I wanted to give a plug for one of my favorite resources of yours, which is a YouTube series. I think if you just search Easing Awake on YouTube, there's a record of your retreat talks. There's about 8 or 9 of them, and I found those really helpful. My brother's going through it now and loves it.
Oh, yeah. No, there's this wonderful guy who was a filmmaker um, out of Los Angeles, who came up and volunteered and filmed all those talks. And so he was a real master, technically to get the stuff right. So he did a lovely job in the production.
Right. Adam, right?
Yeah,
I
Adam
assume.
York.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
So is there something else? Was there anything else that you would want to say as kind of parting words to the listeners?
Um, well, I'll say it. Every morning, my first sitting, I get up and I try to sit for 2 or 3 hours, and my cat Lila comes and jumps up into my lap, and she's very sweet and affectionate, and I think she likes to hear my voice. So I do refuges and precepts and some aspirations, and so she likes to hear my voice, so I say them out loud, and she sometimes responds to me. And her responses are these sounds that sound like a mixture uh, of uh, of a purr and a mew, sort of a trilling at the back of her throat. And I think that what she's saying and all that is, I'm here, you're here, we're here together, life is good. And then she curls up and meditates or goes to sleep. And there's just something about that attitude, that I feel from her, which is something I would like, to leave people with, just a real simple. Um, there's a sweetness to life, and I know, um, the number one, beginning point of the Buddha's teachings is that there is suffering. He didn't say life is suffering, but suffering happens. But there's also a lot of sweetness in it, and probably the most important thing is to when you're approaching practice is to find some way that you can enjoy it. Find a way to enjoy it and let that guide you. There's the Thai have this word I've always loved. It's called sonic, and it's usually translated as happiness. But there's a whole thing behind sonic, which their belief is that if the situation you're in does not have sonic in it, that's a sign from the gods that you shouldn't be doing that. And so you can use your own sense of well-being, not in a narcissistic indulgence, but it's just a way of feeling where there's a lightness, and move towards that. And if what comes up out of that is grief, or there's sadness, then you can just soften into the grief and sadness. Just open your heart to it. And what happens is the grief and sadness you begin to feel, well, everybody feels some of this at times. And so this really connects us all together. And so there can be a poignancy in it. So it's like any feeling you can do that with.
Well, thank you, Doug. This conversation has given me a lot of sonic, so appreciate you coming on.
Yes.
And
thank you.
Yeah, it's been an honor to host you as I guess the first in over a year back on the FitMind podcast.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me. It's lovely.
Hey, thank you for checking out the episode. I hope you enjoyed it. This is part of the FitMind nonprofit, and our goal is to make science and deep meditation accessible to everybody. You can support us on fitmind.org and also by rating and subscribing to the podcast. We believe that mental fitness and mental health are one of the most important things for the world, and it's also a major public health crisis. So by getting these tools out there and making them available, we can really help people and deeply impact their minds and their lives. Thank you.